But I'm going to be very honest. This data shows that the vast majority of Detroiters, when they're leaving Detroit, when they made the decision to leave the city, 2/3 of them say crime is the reason.
On your Daily Detroit for June 6th, 2023, a tale of two Metro Detroits. A recent poll by the Gallup Center on Black Voices and the Detroit Regional Chamber showed some eye-opening statistics. Some feel intuitive depending on where you stand. Others may make you realize that we're having two completely different conversations in the city and in the suburbs, and if you're a person of color or white. Because how Detroit and Metro Detroit looks to you generally correlates around those data points. Because we're experiencing not just two Detroits in the sense of the city of Detroit, but two Detroits in the sense of the region. Let me throw some data at you. With nearly 12,000 people polled, overall, city residents are not satisfied with their schools, where most suburbanites are. 4 in 10 city residents are not satisfied with the availability of good jobs, while nearly 3/4 of suburbanites are. Half of Detroiters say access to a car is a barrier to employment. In the suburbs, it's almost a non-issue. Just over half of city Detroit residents would recommend their community, but 80% of suburbanites would. I'm Jairus Days, and joining me virtually to unpack all of this, Norris Howard. We recorded this conversation while I was at the Mackinac Policy Conference, and he was in Metro Detroit. Good to talk to you, sir, if not virtually.
I'm having a great time. I've been trying to follow along with as much stuff as possible, but we've got a lot to talk about already. And
Yeah, this is a big thing. So you were following along downstate, and I was there in person when we got the information on this first in a long time. And I think first for the Detroit Regional Chamber survey put together by Gallup, a very reputable polling organization, about Detroit resident voices, where they talked to more than 11,000 Detroit residents, city residents, and a number of suburban residents about how they're feeling about living in the region, the challenges they're facing, the things that they're happy about. And man, is this a conversation starter? I don't even really know where to start.
yeah, I think a ton of it is really telling, especially along the lines of things like crime, education, and a lot of this. First of all of the survey is self-identified. So this is what Detroiters were saying about themselves. But the Gallup poll actually was really interesting, as it also continued to make the distinction between the city proper and the suburbs. And there are some stark differences that I think here regionally we may have not been quite as honest with ourselves about. And I think this poll really serves, really in many cases, as a wake-up call to a lot of us in the region.
I think so too. It also embodies for me a big trend here is that if you live in the suburbs, you think things are great. And if you live in the city, there's a pretty good chance you don't think things are great, especially if you're Black living in the city. And it speaks to this dichotomy that I feel, because we are a show grounded and rooted in the city of Detroit, but serving the entire region. And there is such a different attitude between suburban listeners and city listeners, whether it's transit, education, where the region places. There's this huge difference, and it's in this data that we're going to go through a little bit, that we talk about two Detroits in the city. I think there are two Detroits in Metro Detroit.
Absolutely. It's spelled out through this survey. And first of all, I think Gallup did a pretty fantastic job of, getting the numbers and actually getting into the city. If you look through this study, you'll see they touched virtually every neighborhood in the city of Detroit through this survey, which feels great to me, because a lot of times what you'll see with these surveys is only certain areas are going to be polled, and they went to every neighborhood. And the thing is that there are some points of data that obviously I think will be a little confusing to native Detroiters, folks who live in the neighborhoods. But we just got to also keep in mind that, a lot of the most dense areas of the city feel very differently from the more far-flung areas of the city out in the neighborhoods. So with that context put forth, I still think this was a really great job done by Gallup, and there's a lot of very telling information in this particular poll.
For sure. And I'm going to be interested to see how this develops over time, because this is the first of what they're hoping to be annual surveys. And I'm so glad to see a survey size that matters, right? Like, it isn't just a few hundred, it's thousands of people. And you can look at this map. You're talking about the percentages, who's in the survey, things like that. And you look at the map of people who are thriving in Detroit neighborhoods. And it's the neighborhoods that are coming that, people look like that are coming back. And we'll link to the survey on there. But you're talking about your university districts. You're talking about your Bagleys. You're talking about your downtowns, your Indian villages, your Jefferson Chalmers, your, East English Village, things like that where, people feel like they're thriving as opposed to struggling. And that's kind of how they looked at it. I think there's a few topics we need to talk about. Like one, I know for our listeners, this is a big one, is transit. Like the needs and perception of need in transit is so different in the city and the suburbs.
Yeah, the differences are quite frankly stark. Most Detroiters are saying that not having access to public transit or vehicle is a thing that hinders their ability to essentially find gainful employment. Now, obviously, transit has been a large part of our conversation here in Metro Detroit. It's been something that continually will be a large part of the conversation in Detroit. But in the suburbs, it's fine. They're not having that issue. They're not seeing that transit or access to vehicles hinders their ability to live full and fruitful lives. And the thing that I think is most telling with this particular point is that you are not going to be able to get really true, genuine partnership with the city of Detroit and the rest of the suburbs as long as this sentiment remains what it is. Based on this data, you're not going to be able to get the same amount of cooperation from Oakland and Macomb and the outlying counties and really outlying Wayne County either, because the suburbs don't feel like this is their issue. They don't feel that transit is an issue that they need to help solve, and the data shows that.
Well, you and I have been around a minute, so you and I remember when DDOT buses used to run more into the suburbs, and to see kind of that flare-up recently where DDOT's going to be extending service into Livonia, even though Livonia doesn't pay into SMART, because there's a need for city residents to do that. That is something that I think we're going to see more of. I think if you're going to look and you want to be like in transit areas, I think the progress is going to have to be in the city of Detroit. And I don't think we'll see much leadership in the suburbs for expansion beyond SMART, because the theme that I get when I've been up here is that the transit conversation outside the city of Detroit is done. SMART is funded.
Yeah.
And it's done for 3 years until SMART next time. There is no talk about money for RTA. There is for Regional Transit Authority. There's no talk about money for anything else. And that's because when they talk to their constituents back home, outside of a few areas, your Grosse Points, your Ferndales, we've talked about these before, where there's more of an urbanist mindset, this isn't an issue. This isn't something they care about. And so I think what we could see in the future, an interesting way to get around this might be, is if, say, places that want more transit worked with SMART for enhanced services and worked with the city, but like the idea that we're going to have some sort of like great investment from end to end, I think you need to wipe that out of your mind as ever happening like in our lifetime. Now, the city of Detroit, the BRT things they want to do, stuff like that, I think you could see a lot of investment there. But the city of Detroit is hamstrung by budget and resources.
To your point, you may see some of that in greater Wayne County. I think there may be some willpower to do it, especially as we talk about downriver in the near western suburbs. There may be some will to do that. But you're absolutely right. Oakland County, we can get rid of that as a possibility. I personally think that not just based on this data, but also, the other socioeconomic reasonings behind that. We tried it and I want us to keep trying it, but I just don't foresee it being something that Oakland or Macomb County will ever dedicate any sort of sources to, especially now with the discourse being so polarizing. And let's not, completely negate the racial elephant within the room that goes along with that. But again, based on this data, keeping Detroiters out of these towns seems to make suburbanites feel better about the transit situation, and that's just how it is.
Yeah, I think too, if you look at it and go, well, my ideal is 2 cars and whatever, then you're going to look at it and say, well, that works for me. I don't need to spend extra tax dollars on something that I don't feel like I'm going to get any benefit from. Now, on the other side, I think when it comes to attracting talent, this could be an opportunity that the city of Detroit and select suburbs who want to play have, because if you want to attract that kind of like urban, knowledgeable talent, there's only going to be a few places where those companies are going to set up. They're not going to set up in a Livonia or a Warren or a Troy because they're not going to be plugged into whatever system it is. And the other side of it is, if you look geographically, that's about the size. This city of Detroit and around is about the biggest you can really handle with transit. We're just so like far flung across the region that making this work, it's not going to happen. And so I look
No,
at that transit
no.
issue, and I look at the other things that are stark differences in Detroit. One of them being perceptions of education. And you talk about perceptions of, making it and where people want to live. And it's just not great news, especially when you look at African Americans in Detroit. When you look at white people and Hispanics in Detroit, they're a lot more positive about this. And as I said, I'll link to all this information in the show notes. But there is a huge chasm there. And as one of the questioners in this session that I was a part of and you were a part of said, if the vast majority of Detroiters, which is African American, if like only half of them want to be there, that's a problem.
It's a major problem. And honestly, I know we talked about this a couple weeks ago, discussing the story about the expansion of cameras within the city of Detroit. Well, I know a lot of people felt very differently about this than I did, but I'm going to be very honest. This data shows that the vast majority of Detroiters, when they're leaving Detroit, when they make the decision to leave the city, 2/3 of them say crime is the reason. And also, in this same data set, Detroiters want more policing. They want to feel safer. So if we're going to continue to talk about the issues may plague Detroit, or the issues that, we could talk about transit, we could talk about the schools, we could talk about all these things, but at the end of the day, the very bottom of Maslow's hierarchy is safety. Like food, water, shelter. And through shelter, that means safety. If we're going to continue to talk about these things, I'm not necessarily one that thinks, DPD is this, great paragon of how law enforcement should work. But I do think that there's something to this data. And then in the same breath, African Americans are saying that the schools need to improve. They're almost half of them are saying Detroit is not a place that they want to raise their children. And at the end of the day, if there's no kids in the city, if there are not people being raised there who call Detroit home from the moment they're born to the moment they die, hopefully well into their late golden years, then the city will never grow. And so these are the two things that I think Detroit and Detroiters, hand in hand, have to talk about honestly. And they have to be very, very frank about this. And quite frankly, a lot of the listeners of this to be very honest and frank about that, because I think that there's a lot of moments where we sort of live in this sort of midtown, downtown Indian Village bubble where things are pretty okay. And you're not seeing the level of crime that you would see in other parts of the city. But let's not forget about all the stuff that happens every weekend in Greektown, right? And this is me as a born and raised Detroiter. I just have to be honest with myself and say crime is still a big issue in this city. And until we get a more holistic view of that and a way to address that, there's forever going to be issues with retention in the city.
Interesting numbers to me. First off, I'm going to say Fox News is completely wrong about Detroit, right? Because actually, back the blue in Detroit, here's an interesting number. Most Black city residents say local police treat them fairly, 62%, so basically almost a super majority, and 60% want more police to spend more time in their area. And when you look at Twitter and you look at Facebook and whatever, that isn't what you see. But these numbers reflect what I hear from block captains. These numbers reflect what I hear from longtime city residents going, safety is their number one concern. And even in recent things about the newsletter and whatever that I sent out, you know what came back to me from residents? Safety. We need to have more conversations about safety, more cops. One, I remember specifically was like, city residents deserve the same safety levels that are in St. Clair Shores, Grosse Pointe, Berkeley. Like, it should be just as safe. And until it is, they're going to be eyeing a move.
Absolutely.
That's just something that we have to reconcile, some of that politics. And so when you see something like Mike Duggan do something with the police officers or stand by the chief or whatever, and I see online, what is he doing? He's just reflecting the majority of the city that doesn't tweet.
Absolutely. And beyond that, again, the city of Detroit, going back to even what we talked about last week, the city of Detroit is a largely African-American police force that reflects the city that it polices. So a lot of those cultural conflicts, I'm not saying they don't happen, but there's a lot of what I like to call cultural competency amongst the DPD, simply because a lot of those officers come from these communities. And that's very important. And that's why you don't see that same level of friction in Detroit as you've seen in other cities such as New York, Los Angeles, Atlanta, and others. And I really appreciate you saying that, Jared, because If we're talking about what Detroiters, the people who are in the city, who've lived in the city, who've been in the city for years, from all parts of the economic spectrum, all of them, for the most part, as we're seeing, again, almost a super majority, saying that safety is their number one issue. And not just that, the issue that causes them to leave. So until we talk about that honestly, and until the legislature and the DPD can come together and make citizens feel more safe, I don't know how any of the other issues get solved.
Yeah, and then you get into education. There's definitely a gap there. One thing I'll mention here, in this area where you live, are you satisfied or dissatisfied with the availability of good jobs? City residents, only 39% are satisfied with the availability of good jobs. In the suburbs, it is 72%. And that is a huge gap. And that ties into that transit number where 51% of Detroiters, have transit, have the lack of ability to move as a barrier to employment. And to me, that's a huge thing. In fact, the head of the Detroit Regional Chamber talked about, like, he had heard that, a third of Detroit households didn't have, access to a car. And that's about the right number. It's something like that. There are a lot of car restricted households in the city of Detroit. But to see that half of the people looking for jobs can't get to jobs, that's geographically locking people in poverty. And I feel like everyone says, pull yourself up by the bootstraps. We need to go ahead and provide some boots and straps to make that happen. Meanwhile, in the suburbs, they just don't see that same issue and they don't perceive that same issue.
It's very shocking because, and I don't know if people know this, but I've moved out of the city fairly recently. And obviously, I still have a lot of love for the city of Detroit, and I'm in the city of Detroit on a weekly basis, bare minimum. And most of my family is still in the city, and I spend a lot of money there. And the thing about it is that I'm noticing when I go to spend my money in the city, I'm only going to two places. There's only 2 to 3 neighborhoods. I'm either downtown, midtown, or I'm on Avenue of Fashion, right? Outside of that, there's not a lot of other places for me to go and spend money. So what does that mean? That means that there's not many jobs to go around, at least from a retail and storefront point of view, in the city.
Well, it's not like you don't know where to spend. Like, it's not like you're somebody coming from some area that's unfamiliar. You know every corner of this town, and that's still where you go.
Yeah, but the thing about it is that when you go out to the suburbs, and this is always, at least in my mind, an indicator of how well some place is doing economically, look at how many teenagers are working at your fast food places, right? If your fast food or, local corner ice cream shop or whatever is staffed by mostly teenagers, that's a great thing, because that means the adults in that neighborhood aren't having to work at McDonald's or Burger King because they have other more, quote unquote, more fruitful careers. They're working in other aspects of society. And what I notice when I go back to the city is I'm seeing a lot of our seniors working in those kinds of jobs, people who are 50 plus working in those kinds of jobs. And that's an indicator to me that these are people are working because they have to. They have no choice. And it's really, really tough when we're looking at, obviously the data here shows that people want better jobs, but the jobs aren't there and everybody can't work for Quicken. We talk about downtown being Gilbertville and a lot of these big companies that come down and want people to move downtown. We got to get to a point where some of those companies are saying, I'm cool with putting my HQ in the west side of Detroit and not downtown. I'm cool with putting a store in Indian Village as opposed to right downtown. I'm cool with being on Greenfield and Grand River as opposed to downtown. That's going to be the stuff that really begins to revitalize a lot of the neighborhoods and even some of the surrounding suburbs as well, because people will want to drive into the city to go to those places. But we're not seeing that, and that means that people can't find the jobs. And then if you can't drive out to the suburbs to get a job, yeah, you're locked into a cycle of poverty that without, government intervention, there's kind of no way for you to get out of it.
Before we wrap up this conversation, I want to talk about healthcare a little bit. Half of city residents, according to the data, are satisfied, about half, 51%, are satisfied with the availability of quality healthcare services, but 3/4 of Americans are. So there's definitely a disparity there. And then even fewer city residents, 28%, say it is easy to access mental health services in their area. There seems to be some sort of link here with like depression, economic opportunity, all those things. I feel like there's a real mental health crisis that we need to address, not just with like the trauma of life, but I mean, let's just be honest, there's generational trauma out there too.
Generational trauma, racial trauma, economic trauma, and those are sort of a triple whammy that happens to hit the Black community of Detroit. And the fact that mental health services have not been invested in and expanded within the city, I think is a tragedy that could cost untold amounts of strife, stress, and potentially lives. The mental health crisis, as we know, was exacerbated over COVID. But it seems in the post-COVID world that we've begun to sort of de-emphasize that, right? Now that, the world is back to normal, quote unquote, right? There's not been as much of an emphasis on that. But these things go hand in hand with gainful employment. You know, people across the country and in the suburbs can feel better about healthcare because they have it, point blank, period. And obviously there's ACA, there's the ability to go in the marketplace and get healthcare, but hey, if you got a job paying for your health care, that also nowadays a lot of employers are wrapping in mental health services with their health care plans. These are things that all improve people's quality of life. But if you don't have access to those sorts of things, it's really hard for somebody to make the decision to say, I want to go and get mental health care over, I want to keep my lights on, or I want to put gas in my car this week, or I have to feed my kids. That's a tough decision that I think almost everybody will choose the more immediate physical need over mental health. And so a lot of this survey tells us what we quote unquote already knew. But at the same time, I think it also is very telling about just how wide some of the gaps are. And when it comes to mental health, this is probably the one that stands out to me the most as a African American that, you know, is concerned about the future of the people of the city, not just the city itself.
I really encourage people to take a look at this. There's so many different facets. We obviously can't get onto all of them in one podcast, but I will link to it in the show notes. It's a fascinating report by Gallup and the Detroit Regional Chamber. Go ahead and take a look. dailydetroit@gmail.com. Would love to hear your thoughts. Norris, thank you so much for discussing this with me. We took a first whack at it. It's real possible we'll take another one, especially with a little bit of feedback, but I really appreciate you today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. I hope people look at this data with a clear and objective eye, because I think there are some pathways forward based on this data. As
always, your feedback is welcome. dailydetroit@gmail.com. And I'm putting a link to this full survey in the show notes so that you can take a look at it and look at it from different angles. All right, with that, I am Jer Stays. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you to our members on Patreon, patreon.com/dailydetroit. Your support is appreciated. Take care of each other, and we'll see you around Detroit.